And today, we are committing $500 million from this fund to support capital investments to help food businesses expand capacity, increase productivity, and strengthen our food supply for the future.
Canada has just thrown a $500 million curveball into the North American power game. Prime Minister Mark Carney unveiled a sweeping food supply overhaul designed to harden Canada against global shocks and, more importantly, against the political turbulence coming from Washington. At the very moment Donald Trump is threatening new tariffs and publicly belittling Canada's leadership, Ottawa responds not with outrage, not with speeches, but with a strategic investment shifts the balance of leverage. It is not hard to see why this caught the White House off guard.
We can control what we build so that these times will be better in the future. We choose to build Canada strong for all Canadians.
The announcement came during Carney's latest press conference in Ottawa, framed inside his broader campaign to build what he repeatedly calls a stronger, more independent Canada. The centerpiece is a 5-year plan to boost the GST credit for lower-income Canadians and deliver a major one-time top-up this year. But the real headline is the $500 million commitment to expand domestic food production and processing capacity. Carney tied rising grocery costs directly to global instability, climate pressures, and increasingly aggressive tariff policies abroad. His message was that Canada cannot rely on foreign supply chains the way it did a decade ago. Not anymore. The country needs more greenhouse production, more processing plants, more local capacity to keep shelves stocked and prices stable. And that need becomes even urgent when your closest neighbor is actively using tariffs as leverage. That neighbor, of course, is the United States, and the timing of the announcement was impossible to separate from the escalating rhetoric out of Washington. Trump had just floated the idea of 100% tariffs on Canadian goods if Ottawa grows too close to China. He rescinded Carney's invitation to a U.S. forum, mocked him as governor, and openly signaled that the upcoming USMCA review in 2026 will be handled with maximum pressure. Carney did not answer insult with insult. Instead, he answered with infrastructure. He answered with domestic investment. He answered with a plan that reduces the vulnerabilities Trump is actively trying to exploit.
On its surface, this is a policy about food affordability, but underneath that, it is a recognition that Canada has entered a new era, an era where global shocks and weaponized trade policies can disrupt basic necessities within months. Carney openly acknowledged that tariffs have contributed to higher food prices in recent years, a point Canadian consumers have increasingly felt in their wallets. By investing heavily in domestic capacity, Canada is quietly insulating itself from the next wave of tariff battles. It is a defensive move wrapped inside an affordability program, and it tells you exactly how seriously Ottawa is taking the possibility of renewed economic confrontation with Washington. This is not a public relations maneuver, nor is it a symbolic gesture. It is an operational shift, one that will take years to fully materialize, but one that immediately signals to the United States that Canada is preparing for the long game.
Trump's strategy relies on the assumption that Canada will blink first. He uses tariffs the way past presidents used diplomacy, loudly, publicly, and often without restraint. But Carney's response shows a government that is no longer willing to be reactive. Instead of retreating from diversification, Canada is accelerating it. Instead of downplaying its economic partnerships with countries the U.S. disapproves of, Ottawa is openly broadening them. What makes this shift even more significant is that it comes at a moment when U.S. politics are deeply fragmented. Canada is not just responding to Trump, it is responding to an American system where policy direction can swing sharply every 4 years. That volatility forces middle powers to rethink long-term dependence. Carney's plan acknowledges that reality by embedding resilience directly into domestic infrastructure. It's not a rejection of the U.S., but a recognition that stability must now be built at home rather than borrowed from Washington. And instead of responding to Trump's provocations, Carney is building policies that make those provocations less effective. This is a shift Trump did not anticipate. He expected a defensive posture. He got a strategic recalibration. That recalibration comes at a moment when the U.S., according to multiple reports, is struggling to maintain stable supply chains of its own. For Canada to take steps towards self-sufficiency, especially in something as politically potent as food production, undermines one of Washington's key pressure points. Inside the U.S., the political environment is defined by its own upheavals. Trump is trying to regain economic leverage over allies, rebuild manufacturing-heavy narratives, and position himself as the dominant voice heading into the 2026 trade renegotiations. But Canada is no longer behaving like a country dependent on American goodwill. It is telling that Carney highlighted Canada's job growth outpacing the U.S. since August, even in absolute terms, a subtle but unmistakable reminder that Canada's economy is gaining strength, not losing it. Inflation in Canada has returned to the central bank's target range. Energy exports remain vital for U.S. refineries, giving Ottawa leverage Trump cannot fully counter. And globally, Canada has inked new trade agreements across multiple continents in only half a year. So when Carney announced a major food security initiative, precisely the kind of long-term resilience project the U.S. has neglected, it made clear that Canada is preparing for a decade where American policy is unpredictable, and where Ottawa is determined not to be caught exposed.
For decades, Canada's economic strategy revolved around working within the U.S. orbit. That era is over. The policy moves of the last 6 months, diversifying trade partners, strengthening Arctic cooperation with Nordic states, aligning with India and ASEAN on emerging industries, and now reinforcing food security, represent a coherent strategic doctrine. It's the doctrine of a middle power choosing autonomy over dependency. And Carney's calm, measured delivery underscores the point. He doesn't need to escalate verbally. The policy does that on his behalf. The U.S. can threaten tariffs, it can insult Canadian leadership, it can try to intimidate Ottawa on China, but Canada now has a playbook for every scenario. Trump wanted a submissive partner. Carney is building a resilient one. This $500 million plan is more than a food policy. It is a statement about how Canada intends to navigate the next decade of geopolitical uncertainty. By moving first, before negotiations with the United States begin, and before tariff threats turn into actual tariff schedules, Carney is positioning Canada to absorb shocks rather than bend under them. Trump may escalate his rhetoric. He may reach for tariffs again. But for the first time in many years, Canada is preparing its own counters, calmly and systematically. The question now is whether this new strategic independence will hold when the real test arrives, the USMCA 2026 negotiations, where both countries know the stakes are far higher than groceries. And as Canada strengthens its own foundations, Washington must ask itself a question it has not asked in a long time. What happens when Canada no longer needs to play by America's script?
We are going to build big. Because we're going to build big and build often, it's a little more than $80 billion between now and the end of the decade. Now, as much as possible, we will concentrate that on areas where there is dual-use applications. AI is an example, critical minerals is another example, decarbonization, a number of those technologies are there.
Mark Carney has just delivered one of the most revealing interviews of his premiership, and it exposed something Washington did not expect. While Donald Trump has spent months trying to force Canada back into dependency through tariffs, intimidation, and economic threats, Carney calmly sat on stage in Calgary and explained, with almost unsettling composure, exactly why those tactics have no hold over Canada anymore. There were no theatrics, no raised voices, no political jabs, yet somehow the quiet tone made the message even louder. Canada has moved on, Trump's leverage is shrinking, and the world has begun to notice. This video breaks down how a single interview revealed why Trump's pressure strategy has failed and why Canada is entering a new phase of strategic independence that Washington can no longer ignore.
So when you look at it from an energy perspective, we start with our strengths, oil and gas, conventional, but also the innovations that we've done. We have one of the cleanest grids in the world, 80% plus clean power across the country, hydro, nuclear at the core of that. We have the ability to double, possibly triple that over the course of the next 15 years.
What was supposed to be a standard conversation about LNG, energy grids, and infrastructure quickly turned into a declaration of direction for Canada. Carney confirmed that Canada intends to double its non-U.S. exports by 2030 and expand its energy capacity across LNG, nuclear, hydro, low-carbon oil, and hydrogen. He spoke about building an AI ecosystem that isn't dependent on American hyperscalers, a national research architecture strengthened by a $1.7 billion plan to attract top global researchers, and a broader industrial renewal built on critical minerals, domestic processing, and applied R&D. The moment that sent shockwaves through policy circles in Washington came when Carney said, almost casually, we do need to have greater diversification. He made it clear that although the United States remains an important partner, Canada is no longer willing to hinge its economic future on a country whose trade policy changes with every political mood swing. Trump believed Canada had no choice but to accept Washington's demands, but the interview revealed that Canada has already built the escape routes and is walking through them confidently.
For more than a year, Trump has tried to drag Canada back into economic submission by weaponizing tariffs across steel, autos, clean energy components, and lumber. His team assumed that Canada, deeply tied to the U.S. market, would eventually fold. But Carney's interview showed that those tariffs didn't weaken Canada, they accelerated its pivot away from U.S. dependence. Canada used the turbulence to justify an ambitious industrial overhaul. Ottawa accelerated critical mineral development, unlocked new LNG export corridors, negotiated new trade pathways across Asia and Europe, and secured deeper partnerships with South Korea and Japan. Instead of intimidating Canada, Trump inadvertently pushed it to diversify faster than at any point in the last 40 years. It is difficult to overstate the miscalculation. Trump expected fear. Instead, he sparked strategy. Carney's explanation of Canada's future energy landscape was perhaps the most damaging blow to Washington's assumptions. He described a country with one of the cleanest grids on the planet, powered by hydro and nuclear, and capable of doubling or even tripling its clean generation capacity. He spoke of LNG projects built on low-carbon foundations, hydrogen pathways being commercialized, nuclear expansion underway, and interprovincial energy corridors that would reshape the national grid. In contrast, the United States under Trump is swinging between extremes, blocking offshore wind projects, undermining clean energy credits, and igniting uncertainty for renewable developers. Carney positioned Canada as the dependable supplier in a world that is desperate for stable, low-risk energy. Reliability, not volume, is becoming the new currency of global power, and by that definition, Canada is rising just as the U.S. is becoming more unpredictable.
A recurring theme in Carney's interview was the quiet but decisive shift happening in Canada's resource strategy. Instead of exporting raw materials and letting other countries control processing, Canada is now building its own processing capacity, especially in Quebec and Ontario. This reduces dependence on China, but has an equally profound effect on Canada's relationship with the United States. It eliminates one of Trump's favorite pressure points. Washington has long assumed that Canada needs the U.S. market to monetize its mineral resources. But by controlling both the extraction and the processing, Canada no longer has to accept American terms. Mineral supply chains backed by G7 partnerships and EU investment give Canada more choices and fewer vulnerabilities. Trump can tariff aluminum or steel, but he cannot tariff an industry Canada now controls from the ground all the way up the value chain.
One of the most striking moments in the interview came when Carney acknowledged that Canada historically loses many of its best AI graduates to the United States. But instead of accepting this as inevitable, he laid out a plan to reverse the trend, a new productivity superdeduction that makes R&D and data infrastructure far more attractive inside Canada. A Canadian DARPA-style agency called Borealis, a billion-dollar competition to attract 1,000 world-class researchers, and a strategy to lure highly skilled workers who are frustrated by U.S. visa chaos. In other words, while Trump erects barriers, Carney is opening doors. The U.S. is shrinking its talent pool, Canada is expanding its own. And in the global competition for AI leadership, the country that attracts the most minds wins, not the country that yells the loudest.
Carney ended the conversation with a line that summarizes the new era Canada is entering. We are going to build big because we are going to build big and build often. He was talking about community infrastructure, energy megaprojects, national grids, ports in Nunavut, training centers, and the trades-based workforce needed to build a new generation of national assets. But behind the policy detail was a deeper message. Canada is no longer waiting for Washington's permission to grow. It is building its own economy, its own export routes, and its own technological base, and that means Trump's leverage is evaporating.
The United States can pressure a dependent country. It cannot pressure a self-sufficient one.
Carney's interview wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, it didn't attack Trump directly, but it didn't have to. The quiet confidence of his answers revealed that Canada is entering a phase where U.S. pressure simply doesn't work anymore. With a diversified export strategy, a rising clean energy platform, a controlled mineral supply chain, a revitalized research ecosystem, and a talent strategy that turns America's immigration turmoil into Canada's opportunity, the old dynamics no longer apply. So the real question, and the one Canada's allies and rivals are now asking, is simple. If Canada continues to rise at this pace, what happens when Washington realizes it no longer holds the senior partner position in this relationship? Canada's transformation has already begun. Trump just hasn't caught up to it.
But 2025, year one of Trump term two, that's a massive cliff. The latest data showing a more than 30% drop in traffic.
With everything going on in the U.S., I feel like a lot of Canadians kind of want to stay home.
Won't be going to the U.S.
No. We're not going to America. We're not spending our money there. It's Canada first, baby.
Every tally and projection I've seen for 2025 is that the U.S. economy will lose billions of dollars in tourist revenue.
Let's be blunt. The United States is starving for Canadian travelers, and the numbers are now so severe, so one-sided, that Washington can't pretend otherwise. While Donald Trump throws insults across the border and talks about Canada like it's a bargaining chip, the only thing truly collapsing is American tourism. And for the first time in a generation, the message is unmistakable. Canada doesn't need the United States. The United States needs Canada.
The shift began slowly, almost quietly, but the impact has grown into something impossible to ignore. Canadians simply stopped going to the U.S. Recent travel data shows that cross-border car trips from Canada have fallen more than 30% in 2025, marking 10 straight months of uninterrupted decline. Not since the immediate aftermath of 9/11 has the movement of Canadians into the United States fallen off a cliff this sharply. Air travel tells the same story. Newly released statistics show that Canadian return flights from the United States have dropped in every single month of 2025, with declines approaching 30% at times. Meanwhile, Canadians are traveling to Europe, Asia, and within their own country more than ever. In other words, the desire to explore hasn't vanished. The desire to visit the United States has. Part of it is policy. With Trump back in the White House, the border has become more intimidating than inviting. His administration introduced rules requiring Canadians who stay more than 29 days to be photographed and fingerprinted. Survey data indicates that a significant majority of Canadians now view the border environment as intrusive or unfriendly. Part of it is rhetoric. Trump's public comments, calling Canada an abuser, saying it should be America's 51st state, even claiming that Canada wouldn't have a country without the United States, struck a nerve. Canadians heard it, they remembered it, and they acted. And finally, part of it is mood. Many Canadians say they no longer feel welcome, no longer feel safe, and no longer feel any obligation to pour their vacation money into a country that keeps poking them in the eye. "We're not spending our money there," one woman said. "We're done." All of this has pushed American states into panic mode. New York, California, and Florida have launched special advertising campaigns practically begging Canadians to return, some offering hefty discounts, others sounding almost apologetic, and a few distancing themselves from Trump entirely. But the campaigns haven't moved the needle. Canadians aren't coming back.
To understand why this moment matters, you have to look at America's dependency. Canadian travelers are not a niche group. They are the single largest source of international visitors to the United States. More Canadians visit the U.S. each year than travelers from Europe, Asia, and South America combined. When Canadians stay home, American restaurants, hotels, sports arenas, retail stores, and theme parks feel it immediately. Economic estimates for 2025 show that America stands to lose lose nearly $6 billion in tourism revenue because Canadians stopped crossing the border. Businesses in border regions are reporting declining attendance, quieter weekends, canceled event tickets, and a noticeable slowdown that used to be unthinkable during peak Canadian travel seasons. In short, Canada isn't just another tourist market, it's the economic lifeline for dozens of American border communities. The more interesting question is why Canadians are reacting this way now, and the answer is that this isn't about currency or cost or the weather. It's political. Canadians do not respond well to disrespect, especially from a neighbor who claims to be an ally. Trump's comments struck a cultural nerve. The new fingerprinting rules made Canadians feel like suspects, and the tariff war created a sense that the U.S. views Canada not as a partner, but as a target. Polling conducted across Canada shows that the number one reason Canadians are canceling U.S. trips is standing up for Canada, and that is new. Canadians have turned travel into a national statement, and they're doing it with their wallets.
Here's the part Donald Trump never saw coming. Instead of trying to fight this decline, Canada embraced it. Ottawa launched a full campaign encouraging Canadians to explore their own country. National parks introduced free admission days. Federal museums lowered entry costs. Via Rail offered new family incentives. Provinces stepped up with their own promotions, and tourism boards across the country refocused on domestic travelers. The results have been dramatic. Domestic travel inside Canada is booming. Canadian Airbnb bookings within Canada are way up. Summer spending surged in every province. Billions of dollars that used to flow into American border towns now stay inside Canada, supporting local tourism operators, hotels, museums, and regional attractions from Vancouver Island to Prince Edward Island. Trump's hostility pushed Canadians away. Canada turned that push into a national economic win.
For Americans, the situation is not improving anytime soon. Even with major attractions coming next year, including the FIFA World Cup and America's 250th anniversary festivities, industry forecasts indicate that Canadian travel will not return to pre-Trump levels for at least 5 years. That's half a decade of weakened tourism revenue, thinning hotel occupancy, quieter border towns, and permanent changes in travel habits. This is how long-term economic damage starts, not with a crash, but with millions of small decisions that slowly reshape the landscape. Canadians have made their decision. They'll spend their money where they feel respected, welcomed, and valued. In 2025, that place is not the United States. The United States once assumed Canadians would always come, that the flow of tourists, cars, and dollars was a constant of North American life. Now, that assumption has broken. Trump's rhetoric and policies pushed Canadians away. Canada responded by strengthening its own tourism economy. And now America is left staring at empty hotel rooms, struggling festivals, and border towns, wondering what happened. The truth is simple. The U.S. is starving for Canadian travelers, and for the first time in a generation, Canada doesn't feel any urgency to feed them.
You need to choose your friends wisely, and Sweden is choosing Canada, and I think rightly so. And we're also seeing a very strategic work from Canada, and not least from Prime Minister Carney himself, in choosing his friends globally now very, very strategically. And I think Sweden is a great partner to Canada.
Canada just experienced one of the most remarkable diplomatic moments of the year, one that cuts directly to the heart of the Canada-US relationship and reveals how the world is quietly shifting its alliances in 2025. Standing in a Canadian TV studio, Sweden's Deputy Prime Minister Ebba Busch delivered a message so clear, so blunt, and so politically symbolic that it immediately reverberated through Western capitals. You need to choose your friends wisely, she said, and Sweden is choosing Canada. At a time when the United States is pressuring Ottawa over the F-35 contract and warning that NORAD cooperation could be reconsidered, Sweden arrived on Canadian soil and publicly picked Carney's Canada over Trump's America. It wasn't a polite diplomatic gesture, it was a strategic declaration.
The exchange happened during Bush's exclusive interview on Canadian television. She was in the country with an unusually high-level delegation: Sweden's king and queen, top cabinet ministers, and senior executives from major Swedish firms, including Saab. Their visit centered on deepening economic and security cooperation, and more specifically, presenting Saab's Gripen fighter jet as a serious alternative to the U.S. F-35s Canada has ordered. Under the original plan, Canada committed to purchasing 88 F-35s from the United States, but ongoing delays and swelling costs have left a significant capability gap. Only the first 16 jets are on schedule to arrive. That leaves more than 70 aircraft unfilled, which suddenly makes Sweden's timing very strategic. Bush made it clear that Sweden can produce those jets, deliver them, and even build substantial portions of the production line inside Canada. What made this interview remarkable wasn't just Sweden pitching a fighter jet. It was Sweden openly acknowledging the political pressure the United States is exerting on Canada and contrasting that behavior with their own. When asked about U.S. warnings that NORAD could be affected if Canada considers a non-American jet, Bush responded with a directness rarely heard in diplomacy. "If you cave under pressure from a so-called friend," she said, "that weakness will be exploited." The message was unmistakable. Sweden was telling Canada, "We don't threaten our allies, we don't weaponize security partnerships, and we don't make you choose between sovereignty and cooperation."
To understand the weight of Bush's words, you have to look at the global context. The world in 2025 is increasingly unstable, with Putin's war continuing in Europe, China limiting its rare earth exports, and Donald Trump's second term redefining Washington's approach to alliances. The U.S. now ties trade, security, and diplomacy together in ways that create uncertainty for partners. Sweeping tariffs on Canadian goods, threats to Canada's auto industry, and warnings over defense cooperation have all become part of a larger pressure campaign. That shift is pushing many countries, especially in Europe, to reconsider who they trust. Sweden's deputy PM didn't hide that reality. She said the United States has become much more unpredictable, and that Sweden is actively seeking partners who uphold shared values without using leverage or intimidation. In her view, Canada is one of the few countries that meets that standard, a stable, dependable middle power with a consistent commitment to democratic principles and multilateral cooperation. What's striking is that this isn't an isolated opinion. Reuters, Bloomberg, and Global News all report increasing European unease with Trump's foreign policy. Countries like Sweden, Finland, and even Germany have been quietly expanding defense ties with Canada, particularly after Ottawa helped accelerate Sweden's entry into NATO. There's a sense that Canada, under Mark Carney's leadership, offers a level of stability and reliability that Washington can no longer consistently guarantee. Carney's global strategy has amplified Canada's international voice. In the past few months, Canada has signed a security partnership with South Korea, advanced trade talks with ASEAN, and doubled down on its critical minerals strategy with Japan, Germany, and now Sweden. Canada is actively rebuilding the industrial alliances that protect its economic sovereignty, and Sweden's announcement fits perfectly into that narrative.
The Gripen E isn't just another fighter jet on the market. It represents a completely different model of partnership, one where Canada gains industrial capacity, not just aircraft. Saab has already told CBC and the Globe and Mail that it is prepared to shift substantial production to Canadian soil. That means Canadian aerospace workers get the jobs, not American factories. It also means that maintenance, technology transfer, and long-term economic benefits stay inside Canada instead of flowing south of the border. For Washington, that is a direct challenge. The U.S. uses arms exports, especially the F-35 program, as a tool of geopolitical influence. When allies buy American jets, they also buy decades of maintenance contracts, supply chain dependency, and strategic alignment. If Canada takes a different path, it sends a message that the United States is no longer the only option for advanced military systems. That is why the U.S. ambassador's warning about NORAD hit such a nerve. It sounded less like cooperation and more like coercion. Sweden's counter-message could not have been more different. Bush essentially told Canada, a real ally doesn't need to threaten you. A real ally earns your partnership.
It's no accident that Sweden's diplomatic tone is so warm toward Canada right now. Since taking office, Mark Carney has pushed a foreign policy defined by diversification, independence, and long-term strategic planning. His government is actively reducing Canada's reliance on U.S. supply chains, especially in defense, energy, and critical minerals. Carney is presenting Canada as a global partner that is principled but not naive, open to cooperation but unwilling to be pressured. Sweden clearly sees this. Bush praised Carney's global strategy in the interview, saying Canada is choosing its friends very strategically, and that Sweden wants to deepen that alignment. It's a diplomatic compliment, but also a recognition that Canada is emerging as a central player in the Western realignment.
Sweden didn't just bring a proposal to Canada, it brought a public declaration of trust, one that directly contrasts with the behavior Canada has been facing from its closest neighbor. In a world where alliances are shifting and great powers are acting unpredictably, Sweden chose to say out loud what many U.S. partners have been whispering. Canada is becoming the reliable anchor in a turbulent era. The real question now is how Ottawa responds. Canada can accept a partnership based on respect and mutual benefit, or it can continue navigating a relationship where cooperation is tied to threats. Sweden just placed its bet, and it chose Canada.